Hey, welcome back to the Virtual Classroom U.S. History Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And today's topic is the rise of conservatism. And by the way, welcome to period 9 if you're an A-push student. We have arrived in the last time period. But before we begin this all-important lecture, take a moment, hit pause on your screen, and jot down the lecture outline, taking particular attention to those key terms on the left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, as well as be able to tie the key terms together and to their larger historical significance and context. And with that, let's begin. Now, as I said, this is a very important topic. And this is one of those lectures I talked to you about a couple weeks ago of these three major foundational topics that we have in 20th century U.S. history, especially in political history. Now, the first one of which was, of course, the 1930s with the New Deal and FDR that really set the stage for the liberal consensus. The second one, of course, was that Great Society. And of course, they had a lot of Cold War in there as well, but the Great Society, again, expanding on that liberal consensus that confirms that liberal consensus that Americans like a more active federal government. And now we have the third one. And this one is the rise of conservatism, which directly flies in the face, theoretically, compared to that liberal consensus of the 1930s through the 70s. And we're going to pick up right where we left off in our last lecture, which of course was the Jimmy Carter administration. And while the Carter administration floundered terribly with the energy crisis, with his lack of political expertise in Washington, again, Jimmy Carter, bless his heart, just couldn't get a win. And while he is floundering, the Republicans are forging a plan to win back the White House in 1980. And Ronald Reagan is going to be the man who's going to come to the forefront. The former Hollywood actor, the former California governor, was on the rise. But to understand how we get to, well, right there, how we get to Ronald Reagan, we have to go back and we have to understand what is called the New Right, understand the rise of modern conservatism, but understand more specifically a group that's called movement conservatives or movement conservatism. And to understand what movement conservatism is, we have to go back a long way in history. And so we're going to spend the first part of this lecture. This again, guys, this is a lecture that I'm ecstatic for. This is a topic that, even though I studied political history in graduate school, I never fully grasped this big change. Like, I understood the idea of what it was, I understood how it happened. But to understand the historical antecedents that preceded all these things is something I've only begun to really grasp in this last years. I began to do more reading on the topic. And I completely redone this lecture. And I'm so excited to bring it to you here today. So again, we're going to pick up. To understand Reagan's rise, we got to start back with this group known as movement conservatism. Now, they don't start out named that back in the day, but we're going to start, as you see on your screen, we're going back to the 1850s here. And so let's go back and give you a little history lesson here and kind of draw the entire course together to understand Reagan's rise. And so, a little story time here. You see, in response to the crisis back in the 1840s and early 1850s, remember westward expansion, Manifest Destiny, the Mexican-American War? We had a lot of issues surrounding that. Remember, the big issue was, well, how much land we take from the Mexicans, yes. But more importantly, once we decide on that land, should those be slave territories or free territories? And the issue, of course, was the issue of expansion of slavery. Well, the big issue that really harnessed this animosity in political crisis, a lot of it was caused by the Dred Scott case. And you see the man picture there, and of course, the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court. And theoretically, what the Dred Scott decision did, which ruled that just because a slave was taken into a free territory did not alter his status as a slave, theoretically, this decision opened up any territory, any state, to potential slavery. In other words, a slave master from the South could bring his slave northward into a free state or territory and have slaves there, which of course was entirely against their own state constitutions. Now, we know that story very well. We discussed it a long time ago. But let's look at this from a different perspective here. If you also recall from our talk about the Old South, do you recall what percent of Southerners actually owned slaves? Or what percentage of Southerners, Southern whites, were actually large enough landholders to be called a plantation with hundreds of slaves? Remember, you're talking about the top 5, the top 1% of Southerners actually owned what we think of as the Old South plantation slavery. Thus, you could make an accurate statement that basically 1% of the Southern population, 1% of Southerners who actually owned a large number of slaves, actually could embrace this ruling, had all the political power in government in the United States. This very small percent of people, these wealthy, rich, white, land-owning, slave-owning Southerners who owned plantations, were making the political decisions the entire country. Think about that for a moment. Just a handful of people, a handful of families in the South. Thanks to the Dred Scott decision, thanks to the victory of the Dred Scott decision for Southerners, that is, victory for Southerners, they were now firmly in control of government to do what they wanted. And this was very scary for Northerners. This was a crisis of democracy in America for Northerners, because you have a handful of Southerners who are dictating their morality, their economic judgments across the entire continent. And thus, in the late 1850s, you see the formation of a new political party, the Republican Party, and the rise of a leader, Abraham Lincoln. And they will begin to promote and use the government to promote equality. Now, equality before the law, of course, was not necessarily for African Americans at this point, but equality that said, yeah, Southerners can't force their values on Northerners. And so equality before the law, the opportunity for all to have equality. And then, of course, we fight the Civil War. And after the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, during Reconstruction, and then, of course, through radical Reconstruction we talked about, they begin to use the government to make poor men have better opportunities by offering land grants, by providing freed slaves with education, by providing sums of money to help get them a start in life. And in order to do this, they began to separate national finances away from just the wealthy and let all people contribute to the government itself. And of course, this was through taxation, through an income tax, really the first time in our history. Now, Americans, generally speaking, loved this new active government. They were making positive changes, creating greater equality. And again, while no one really likes paying an income tax, it does allow you as an average American to have a greater, stake in the government. It's not just the wealthy making all the decisions because they're the ones funding the government. Well, so after the Civil War, and during the Civil War, Americans seemed to embrace this new, large, active form of government. And after the Civil War was over, Americans pretty much thought this system was here to stay, an active government that would promote equality for all men. Again, we're excluding women here, I know. But their confidence was short-lived, those who thought the active government would stay, because it proved to be the undoing. This overconfidence, this assumption that this new active government would stay, proved to be their undoing, which falls apart very quickly. Because what happens is Southerners begin to argue that, yeah, we don't mind this new thing called equality, but opponents of it, again, they really did mind it. What they were actually arguing was opponents insisted that this new active government was stealing tax dollars from hardworking white men, poor or rich, and redistributing it to those who were too lazy to work or too stupid to work, i.e., people of color, freed slaves. Remember, part of Reconstruction was the jobs program to help African Americans find employment. Part of it was to offer land grants to some African Americans. Part of it was to provide free education for African Americans. Though all those things cost money, which was funded by taxpayer money. And so what these Southern rich whites who were upset over this began to argue was, yeah, all you're doing is taking money from the whites, wealthy and poor alike through income tax, and redistributing that wealth to people of color that, well, people didn't really like due to racism, or calling them lazy and not deserving of it. Again, see how the argument brings the present day? Now, we don't have the word socialism yet, but essentially that's their argument. They're redistributing the wealth, socialism. Now, it kind of dies off a little bit in the 1870s. The government rolls back. If you guys remember correctly, I called that group of presidents from Andrew Johnson forward the crappy president chart. And what we see is the new active government of Lincoln ceases to exist very quickly after his assassination. Instead, by the 1890s, the cycle begins again. This time, it shifts from the South with former slave owners to now the Northeast with industrialization during the Gilded Age. The government now was focused on protection of private property alone, not worker rights. And the rise of national corporations, again, this is something brand new in the 1890s. It concentrated the wealth of America into the hands of a few individual families, who in turn dominated both the economics, the economy, and politics. Think about it. Leaders wrote laws to protect the likes of John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie's of the world. And while ordinary men, the average working class American, increasingly fell behind in a world that they could not push back against their rich employers. Industrialization during the Gilded Age seemed to destroy the equality. And anything or anyone that tried to push against the system was immediately labeled socialist by the government trying to control you, the individual. Let me repeat that. So anything, remember, look at your screen right now. You see on the top right, the Haymarket Square riot. Remember, it started because they were protesting for worker rights and workers were killed due by the police in Chicago. And then the police came to break up an already dispersing crowd that caused the actual riot. Bottom left, you see Fort Frick at the Homestead strike in Carnegie's Steel Mill in Homestead, Pennsylvania. These are instances where the police, the military, the militia, remember the Great Railroad Strike, you had the Pullman strike. In all these situations, local police, local officials, and military are called in to squash workers protesting for greater equality, greater wages, better protections, better work conditions. And what was the rallying cry against them? Yeah, any attempt to regulate corporations, to give workers higher wages and better working conditions, was immediately labeled as radical, labeled as anarchist or socialist. That if the government were to help workers, the government would be trying to control you, the individual, and take the power out of your individual hands, which is really backward. Because the job of the government is supposed to promote equality, right? And by helping strikers achieve better work conditions, higher wages, that would in turn promote equality for Americans. But of course, the few rich elites, as you see in the top left picture, they're the ones through corporations that are controlling the government. And the result is, again, we have a crisis of democracy whereby a handful of rich individuals, families in America, and this is Gilded Age, the gold-plated crap, they control everything in our government and in our economy. And the pendulum shifted from the South to the Northeast, And once again, the question is, how do you reverse this pendulum swinging to where all the power is in the hands of businessmen, from the plantation owners back in the 1850s, 1860s, to now the industrialists, these captains of industry, if you will, during the Gilded Age? And of course, the answer to that, of course, you all know, was the Progressive Era. And in the Progressive Era, we started redefining those captains of industry now as robber barons. And so to adjust to this new crisis in the 20th century, this crisis of American democracy, voters began to back government regulation and using government intervention in society to guarantee equality of opportunity to ordinary men and their children. Again, they thought, like Lincoln did, that the purpose of government was to provide equality of opportunity to Americans and their children. And of course, you know the story. Under Teddy Roosevelt, the government began to restrict, began to regulate the worst impulses of capitalism, and began to reform the action of these so-called robber barons, trying to curb their exploitation of workers and get them to contribute to the urban societies in which they thrived. Remember, they're thriving on the backs and the pains of their workers and the communities in which they live. Congress tried to limit child labor so children could go to school and get an education, and to create an environment where poor citizens could once again rise and achieve the American dream. This was the goal of the Progressive Era, to reestablish the American dream. And Roosevelt recognized this. You remember the story during the coal strike where he threatened to, or he wanted to chuck the negotiators for the mine owners out the window. And he threatened to actually have a government take over the mines. It worked. And Roosevelt recognized that in order for an individual to thrive in this society, in America, government must grow stronger so it can level the playing field between rich and the hardworking poor. And again, not to dismantle capitalism, not to get rid of the rich even, but to level the playing field to where the average American has a chance, to shrink the gap between the haves and have-nots, to help eliminate that huge disparity of wealth between the mega rich and the average American. And so, as the Progressive Era began to file down those sharp edges of industrialization, and to restore the equality that underpins democracy, once again, Americans kind of fell into a general state of malaise or relaxation. They stopped paying attention again. And we will start seeing a backlash against the Progressive Era, which of course came after World War I. Of course, World War I is a big turning point because it stoked a lot of fears in Americans due to international conflict, due to warfare, due to people dying, and of course, due to the Spanish flu that came immediately thereafter. And so what do we get next? The 1920s. And of course, the Roaring Twenties, well, not so much. Instead, what we get was the campaign promise of return to normalcy. In the 1920s, once again, the cycle begins once again. So in the 1850s, 1860s, it was the rich white plantation owners or former slave owners. 1890s, it was these industrial capitalists, these robber barons, captains of industry, Carnegies, Rockefellers. Well, in the 1920s, we have a new breed of politician taking office. And once again, men determined to protect their right to accumulate wealth insisted that government should have no role in regulation or social welfare, and that the job of government was only to protect their private property. And what happens? Republicans elect three straight Republicans. And of course, Warren Harding, his quote-unquote plan was return to normalcy, back to the good old days of the Gilded Age for businessmen. What did these three men do on your screen? Well, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, they all three did very similar things. They slashed and cut taxes. They rolled back regulations on businesses. They cut back corporate taxes back to the Gilded Age, pre-Progressive Era. And they turned the government essentially over to businessmen. And remember, you see the quote on the screen, Calvin Coolidge. one of the most important accomplishments of my administration has been minding my own business. In other words, he stayed out of things. Instead, business ran the country. And of course, Herbert Hoover believed in things like welfare capitalism, which meant that companies should be, willing to help their employees out of the goodness of their heart rather than any government mandates or regulation or minimum wage. And of course, rugged individualism, the idea that, individuals should work hard, they themselves will prosper. Government has no role in promoting that equality or helping those to have what's called equality of opportunity. Remember, we are all equal, theoretically. But does everyone actually have equality of opportunity? Based on where you're born, based on your education level, based on, social and cultural customs? Of course not. That's what Herbert Hoover argued. And so, once again, 1920s, the government was turned over to businessmen in the belief that they alone truly knew what was best for the country. Again, a handful of individuals, a handful of families truly knew what was best for all of America. And once again, you see the movement of wealth, follow the money. Wealth moved upward, and rich men once again dominated government. And for 8 years of 1920s, this sounded really good. It was working, right? The Roaring '20s. This system looked like it was the best ever designed as the economy appeared to boom. Some men became very rich. And while, yes, living wages did go up for everyone, that gap between the richest rich and the lowest low was greater than ever once again. And so that wealth disparity, wealth inequality began to expand once again. And of course, unfortunately, we know that the Roaring '20s came to a crashing halt in 1929. And in the introspection that follows, Americans discover that, you know what? Those businessmen, those financiers, they've been cheating. Even while they were trying to, even while the average American is trying to live within the law, some of those financiers in banking industry and Wall Street stockbrokers and businessmen, even politicians, they were gambling with their customers' money, gambling with Americans' money, buying on speculation, buying on margin. And they were leading to what's called risky schemes that eventually, the bubble burst, the market crashed. And meanwhile, all that supposed economic growth of the 1920s, the Roaring '20s, had not really translated to higher wages or better pay for workers or farmers. All the profit of the 1920s was filtered to the top couple percent, the richest business owners. And of course, Republican President Herbert Hoover assured Americans the economy simply needed a self-correction after the stock market crashed. He refused any large-scale government actions or government programs to steady the economy or the nation, insisting that, government activism would destroy the rugged individualism that lay at the heart of what he thought was the national character. And of course, you all know how that turned out. He turns the military on the bonus army, forces them out of the camp, killing infants. People name Hoovervilles after him, not so fondly. And once again, we're at a crisis of democracy. And then comes the 30s in the liberal consensus, starting in large part thanks to the man pictured here, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So in 1932, his Democratic opponent, Hoover's Democratic opponent, Herbert Hoover's Democratic opponent, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, disagreed that rugged individualism was at the heart of American character. Rather, he argued and offered a New Deal for the American people, who had had their world yanked out from underneath them through no fault of their own. Remember, the average American does not own stock. 90% of Americans do not own any stock, yet they're the ones who are suffering the most during the Great Depression. It's the average American, it's the veteran. And so FDR maintained that the role of government is to step in and, again, not take over the economy, to regulate the economy, to keep businessmen from cheating, from breaking the law, from being risky, and for businessmen to protect their workers. That the government should then provide a basic social safety net so that Americans would not starve if they ever lost their jobs. That government should promote infrastructure to develop resources and enable all Americans to be able to access the modern world. And again, that brings up a great conversation as we're teaching this lesson, because is internet a right or a privilege of a few select people? Is having internet access to do your schoolwork at a time when we're on quarantine during the coronavirus, is it a privilege of a few Americans or a partial group of Americans, or is it a right of all Americans so all students have a chance to learn and not fall behind? FDR thought that the role of the government was to, in fact, develop resources and to enable all Americans to be able to have access to the modern world. Now our modern world involves internet, obviously. So in the long depression that follows the great crash of 29, Americans embraced the New Deal programs. It helped them find work. It offered Social Security for the elderly and the disabled. It built new roads. It built schools. It built airports, libraries, and bridges all over the country. And once again, with this newly active government, went on to fight and win during World War II. Popular support for the new government system was cemented. In other words, this time people really embraced it. And again, it wasn't that they just liked it, they believed it would last. This time they threw their full weight behind it and realized we need to keep making sure we vote this in. Otherwise, it could end again. And so by 1945, again, we talked about this before, this is the liberal consensus now, right? Americans of all political parties, Republican, Democrat alike, embrace the idea that government should regulate business, should provide a basic social safety net, and promote infrastructure building. This belief, of course, is called the liberal consensus, and we talked about a lot. And it was behind both the largest welfare program in American history, Social Security, and even when Republican Dwight Eisenhower was elected in 1952, he even offered his own version of the New Deal, calling it the quote-unquote middle way. Now again, he's not a Democrat. He didn't want to expand the social safety net necessarily. But remember, he is a member of the liberal consensus. He promotes what he called the middle way. And he launched the largest public works project in history, the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System. And remember, taxes are covering up to 91% of this. Most Americans, Democrat, Republican alike, love the new active government. It had pulled the nation out of a depression. It won a world war, and now was presiding over a booming post-war economy. But, and you guys know me, there has to be a but. But, this is a big but. While most all Americans did like this new government, there were a small group of businessmen who loathed it. They loathed the idea that government bureaucrats could tell them how to run their business, these quote-unquote Hoover Republicans. They wanted to go back to the world of the 1920s, which of course was going back to the world of the Gilded Age. They wanted to go back to this idea of when businessmen ran the government. They insisted that the government must do nothing but defend the nation, promote religion. And I say promote religion, but I do mean Christianity. And then they said that this new system, this liberal consensus, was simply just the redistribution of wealth. Sound familiar? Going back to the 1860s, 1870s? In other words, because these programs, Social Security, the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System, the New Deal programs, remember, they're being funded by taxpayer money. That graduated income tax that was established under Woodrow Wilson in 1913. In other words, they're saying, well, all they're doing here with this graduated income tax is they're taking money from the wealthiest of Americans and they're redistributing the wealth to poor Americans. Now, the government sees it as trying to uplift these poorer Americans, give them a chance, equality of opportunity. These businessmen see it as a redistribution of wealth, which means if it's not promoting their cause, if it's going against what they believe, anything else must be socialism. And these bureaucrats that were necessary for enforcing these regulations, for providing the social safety net, this costs tax dollars, forcing wealthy men to pay for government programs that did not really benefit them, it benefited the poorer Americans. Thus, they argued the system infringed on their individual liberties. It must be socialism. Now, was it socialism? No. And I got the definition on the screen for you. You see what socialism actually is. Socialism is a system in which government owns the means of production. That's what a socialist government is. This is important because I think too many times the word socialism has been thrown out so often it's lost its meaning. Again, I don't just mean modern day, which it has today, obviously. Again, anything that is against your opinion, if you're a conservative, is socialism according to modern day politics. But guess what? It was the same way back in the 1950s, 1940s, 1920s, 1890s. It's socialism. But socialism is when it's a system of government when the government owns the means of production. And anywhere have we talked about where the government has taken over the means of production, with some minor exceptions during the actual World War II, when the government did temporarily take over some mines, again for the war effort. With those few exceptions aside, at what time in U.S. history has the government taken over the means of production? Is not the oil industry still private? Is not healthcare still private? Is not manufacturing of all goods still private? The government has not done any of these things. Did not do so, has not done so now. Did not do so back in the 1890s, 19-teens, 1940s, 1950s. And yet, what we did do during all those periods in the 19-teens, in the 1940s and 50s, was this new U.S. system regulated capitalism. It regulated the worst impulses of these industrial capitalists. This new system was designed to stabilize the traditional capitalist economy, so it does not self-destruct like it did in the 1890s when, J.P. Morgan had to bail it out, like it did in 1929 with the stock market crash and the subsequent Great Depression. Now, this group of people called themselves movement conservatives, and they began to organize an attack on New Deal programs. And they really get their start as an organization. Again, up to this point, it's all been theoretical. There aren't really movement conservatives. There's these industrial capitalists who hate the government regulation, that they want to be in charge. But in 1951, everything changes. In 1951, author and intellectual William Buckley Jr., he's a recent graduate from Yale Law School, or Yale University. And right out of college, at 25 years old, he writes a book called In God and Man at Yale, The Superstitions of Academic Freedom. And it's a book in which he's trying to argue that the liberal education at America's universities is flawed, and it's leading down a path of destruction. And that's his basic purpose of writing the book, was to expose, you see on your screen, to expose what he called irresponsible liberal educational attitude as an alma mater. But what he argues in this book, I'm not going to make you read it, but what he argues is that trying to reach the truth by constructing arguments based on facts, which, by the way, is the premise of the Enlightenment, was a worse superstition than the Dark Age traditions that the Enlightenment tried to root out. In other words, He argues that you can't argue with facts. Because quite honestly, in his mind, the facts were leading to a false ending that he did not believe in. And what he's arguing here is that when voters of America are presented with fact-based arguments, such as, we are not socialist, we are just trying to curb the worst impulses of capitalism, regulated capitalism. We are trying to provide equality of opportunity for all Americans so all can rise in the post-war economy. He says that when presented with fact-based arguments, American voters keep choosing the liberal consensus, which they did. They voted for FDR 4 times. They voted for Truman. They even voted for Eisenhower, which Republican, but not conservative Republican. And so far as Buckley is concerned, this liberal consensus in his mind, this liberal consensus idea, it flies in the face of what he called God's laws. So Berkeley concluded in this book that it was imperative to stop arguing based on facts, but rather promote a simple conservative viewpoint of the world by any means necessary. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is he begins to argue and articulate the idea that wealthy men who are businessmen are the ones who should be running the country. But he doesn't say so blatantly, because that obviously will get shot down very quickly. Instead, he argues that there's this large swath of Americans that they don't want all this regulation. What they want is to go back to what they considered the national identity of rugged individualism. That government was trampling the individual. Again, conservatism. Again, guys, don't misread me here. This is not a political statement about Republican Party, Democrat Party. This is, however, movement conservatism. This is not a political side. This is general historical statements, a fact. And to promote his view, he wrote the book in 1951, but in 1955, he organizes what's called the National Review. It's a platform for arguing the movement conservative viewpoint. In other words, intellectuals, economists, businessmen use the National Review, which is still around today, as a way to articulate and put forth under the auspices of a scholarly periodical their viewpoint that this is the economy the world should be. And so what did they actually embrace? What was their basis of their platform, like any good political party? And they believed in things like they were anti-communist. Okay, that makes sense. However, they opposed Keynesian economics, this idea that the government should spend your way out of things. They believed the market should self-correct. Sound familiar? They opposed the welfare state, including Social Security and later Medicare and Medicaid. They opposed progressive taxation. Why should the rich, who worked hard to get their wealth, theoretically, have to get taxed more? Why should they pay more tax, a higher percent, because they worked hard? Why are they being punished? They opposed labor rights for unions. In other words, why should the government or any group of people tell a businessman how to run his business, or what wages they should pay, or what work conditions to give? And ultimately what they embrace is a small government. In other words, now of course you can figure out very quickly who embraces this message. Well, the rich businessmen. The business community loved this idea of movement conservatism. Again, being articulated by others, but specifically William Buckley Jr. And of course, big businesses love it because of the anti-tax and the anti-union message. And I have a little chart there for you, you can see on your screen, that kind of highlights the differences here. And what you see here on this chart is this wealth inequality between the rich and poor. And you see where it starts to come down, this wealth inequality. So during the post-World War I, during the 1920s, the wealth inequality grows. By the time the New Deal is cemented by 1936, 1937, you see how it starts coming down. Of course, it dips mightily during the war and then levels out at a nice low level where middle-class Americans are making better, well, wages during this liberal consensus period. So during the liberal consensus from 1937 through 1975, 1976, up to 1980, you see where there's a very low wealth inequality difference. Again, it's not that it's still out there, it still exists, but it's compacting, contracting. And of course, 1980 is what we're going to see when conservatism takes over. It begins to, well, increase once again to the point where today we're right back to what it was in the 1920s, back to the 1890s. And of course, so they get this huge influx of capital from these businessmen who would like this idea. Well, so you can see why that this chart shows how between the rich and poor and liberal consensus that it seemed wrong to businessmen because the government is, well, in their minds, redistributing the wealth. And this chart shows that. Now, wasn't the government redistributing? Well, I guess if you're in their perspective, it was. But to most of America, this was a chance to uplift all of America, provide equality of opportunity. Now, the reality is, though, movement conservatives had very little backing in the 50s and 60s. Now, they did find one primary candidate in 1964, of course. They would get their first presidential candidate in Barry Goldwater. And, well, you remember how well he did. Now, one would think that movement conservatism would fracture after Goldwater debacle. Remember, he gets destroyed by LBJ. And surprisingly, though, the movement conservatism did not fizzle out. Rather, they began to reformulate and rethink. And they began to move beyond just the National Review. Instead, they began to they formed what was called an intellectual infrastructure. And these were called think tanks. And they began to form these think tanks that would produce all these academic, intellectual, economic, peer-reviewed works through these foundations. And you see them listed there. These are the Heritage Foundation, the Cato, they're all still around today. I heard about the Heritage Foundation just last week again. They're still around. And what they did, though, by doing this was they began to create a more palatable, coherent message to reach beyond just those rich businessmen. Because remember, can you really win the presidency with just those old white rich men? Yeah, no. The old white businessmen are very important, these rich businessmen. They're necessary to win elections, but they can't win it by themselves. And so what this intellectual new right did under movement conservatism was they began to articulate a better plan. And they moved beyond just the anti-union, anti-tax message to use those cracks in the cultural consensus, the culture of conformity of the 1950s and 1960s, to highlight that so-called long history of liberalism and socialism and government interference. And their argument drew directly from the years of Reconstruction after the Civil War, when the Republican national taxes that were invented during the Civil War to basically pay for war, pay for pensions, and pay for infrastructure building. But that income tax coincided with the 1870 15th Amendment that guaranteed the right to vote for freed slaves. Now again, those two things were not related. Income tax and the 15th Amendment for the voting rights for African Americans, they were not intrinsically linked. They just happened to overlap based on time frame. And so white supremacist Democrats in the South began to argue disingenuously that they had no problem at all with black men voting. What they objected to in their lying reasoning was that poor men were only voting for leaders who promised them free stuff. Roads, schools, hospitals in the war-damaged South that could only be paid for with taxes that were levied on the people in the South who actually had money. Those rich white men, landowners, those former plantation slave owners. This, they said, was socialism. Now, that was the 1870s, 1860s, right? That was the post-World War construction period. Now let's flash forward now to 1954, Brown v. Board of Education. Supreme Court required desegregation of public schools. This, again, enables the movement conservatives to harness racism in their argument once again. They had largely been dormant since the 70s. Well, Jim Crow's under attack in the 50s, and they're able to harness racism into their conservative argument, harping on the idea that an activist government that is flexing their muscle as an activist government to protect African Americans. Okay, that's what happened, right? This activist government, including Eisenhower sending in the air troopers to desegregate Little Rock High School, this cost taxpayers money. Remember, it's taxpayers' money is being used to help integrate these public schools with the use of the National Guard, with the use of the military, using the police force. All these things cost taxpayer money. And of course, who's the taxpayer money coming from? Well, not those poor African Americans, of course. No. It comes from hardworking white Americans. And so the message here was clear. This way was clear for these men to argue that an active government was not about promoting and protecting equality, but rather it was simply a way to give benefits to Black and brown people. Think about that for a minute. So these new laws, whether it's the civil rights laws of the late 50s and the 60s, or the desegregation laws, or Martin Luther King trying to desegregate the South and Jim Crow laws, they argue that the government getting involved in this was not about protecting equality. It was simply a way to give benefits to a group of people who were usually of color, Black and brown, paid for by white tax dollars. Because they argued with progressive taxation, these Black and brown people are poor, they don't pay any taxes anyway. So who's paying for these programs? Who's paying for these troops? Well, it is, of course, the white taxpayers. And so this, again, was seen, they argued, as a redistribution of wealth that hurt white people to help African Americans and Hispanics. And with this appeal to racism, movement conservatives were able to break through what had become known as the liberal consensus. Voters began to swing back. And again, it made it easy in the 1960s with all the racial violence, those race riots, the student protests. Voters began to swing back to the Republican Party, who promised lower taxes, cut these welfare programs that sucked money from the nation's makers to the nation's takers. In other words, it sucked the money from the rich white men or white people in general and gave it to those who only want to mooch on the system, Black and brown people, poor people. And again, you can find this message still today, right? 2 generations later, the heirs of the movement conservative are still alive and well. And if you think about it, we'll talk about this a little bit when we get to the 2000s lecture. How much better can you get it right now? You have not a politician in government right now. Again, this is not being political whether you love or hate Donald Trump. But movement conservatives have the ultimate prize in the White House right now. They have a businessman, not a politician. He is, even though he's, for most of his life, he was a Democrat, he's essentially what these movement conservatives want, a businessman in politics. Now, what made it so easy for them, of course, was that they were able to refine their message even further. Now, the 50s instituted the idea of racism. 1960s made it all the more easy to refine this message because the New Deal state was continued. The Great Society expanded it, and the continued civil rights activism followed by identity politics and racial riots. This is what's going to finally break down the liberal consensus. And all these things coalesce for the movement conservatives. 100 years after the Civil War, this equation that people of color would only vote for government leaders who gave out freebies that were paid for by hardworking white men was the argument on which businessmen after World War II finally broke through the liberal consensus. Let me repeat that. 100 years after the Civil War, 1960s, this equation, the idea that people of color will vote for government officials and government benefits that are paid for by hardworking white men, was the argument that businessmen made after World War II that will finally break the liberal consensus in the late 60s, early 70s. It's the same argument they were making back during Reconstruction. Like, you're taking the taxes, the wealth, the money from hardworking white men and giving it to people of color. You're redistributing the wealth. And the malaise and stagflation of the 1970s only seemed to confirm this. And you can even see it in popular, remember, stagflation, the malaise of the 70s, dejection, angst, turmoil. Even popular movies in the 1970s seem to confirm this. Take Rocky, for example. It's a great movie, won Best Picture at the Oscars. Love the movie. But if you look at it from a different perspective, it is a quintessential example of the feeling of the 1970s. Look at it this way. The champ, Apollo Creed, African American. He lived in luxury while the quote-unquote true American, the white Italian Rocky Balboa, who went to church every Sunday, prayed hard with his beads. He worked hard every day, but was still down on his luck. Hard to find work, lived paycheck to paycheck, barely able to make his way by. And even when he has a chance at the championship for the belt, he fought. He went the distance. And then, what happens? He lost. He lost in a decision to an African American. So even when the white guy, the white man, gave all he had, given the chance, finally took that chance, went the distance, people thought he should have beat Apollo. And yet, Apollo, the African American, was awarded the decision, i.e., the Democratic government, the liberal consensus government, Democrat Republican under Eisenhower as well, was helping people of color rather than true Americans, i.e., whites. So you can see very quickly why this appealed to so many Americans. Now, this is a little bit longer lecture than normal. I apologize for that. But I think this is fascinating given our current state of politics. And I hope you have a better understanding of this. We're going to stop here, and we're going to pick up with part 2 of this lecture with Reagan's actual election. How does Reagan able to bring this all together and win the White House? But until next time, take care and bye-bye.